Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history near Fayetteville, Arkansas. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. On December 17, 1903, a postal carrier named Elijah Winters made his usual route along the eastern outskirts of Fayetteville, Arkansas. The winter had been particularly harsh that year, with early snows and bitter winds sweeping down from the Boston Mountains. As he approached the cluster of 5 modest cabins that housed the Blackwood brothers, he noticed something peculiar. No smoke rose from any of the chimneys despite the freezing temperatures. The doors to each cabin stood slightly ajar, swinging gently in the wind. Inside he found cold hearths, half-eaten meals, and personal belongings seemingly abandoned mid-use. The 5 Blackwood brothers, Thomas, Samuel, William, Joseph, and Elias, had vanished without explanation, leaving behind only the haunting stillness of their empty dwellings. What made the disappearance particularly unsettling was that the brothers had been prominent figures in the local timber industry, known throughout Washington County for their skill and reliability. They had arrived in Fayetteville in the spring of 1898, establishing themselves as independent contractors supplying oak and pine to the booming railroad and construction businesses. The eldest, Thomas, was 42 years old, while the youngest, Elias, had just celebrated his 31st birthday. They were unmarried men who lived in their individual cabins, arranged in a neat semicircle on a wooded tract about 4 miles east of the Fayetteville Square. Each brother specialized in different aspects of the timber trade, from felling to transport to negotiations with the larger lumber companies. They were educated, articulate men who kept to themselves but were respected for their fair dealings and exceptional work ethic. The brothers had appeared in Fayetteville during a transformative period in the region's economic development. The St. Louis and San Francisco Railway, commonly known as the Frisco, had established its presence in northwest Arkansas in the early 1880s, triggering a timber boom that would reshape the landscape and economy of the Ozarks. The railroad's expansion created an unprecedented demand for timber, not only for cross ties, but also for construction materials to serve growing communities along its routes. By 1898, when the Blackwoods arrived, Washington County was experiencing a rush of timber-related enterprises, from small family-operated sawmills to substantial operations like those run by J.H. Phipps, who would later become one of the region's most prominent lumber businessmen. The Blackwood brothers positioned themselves not as employees of larger companies, but as intermediaries who could reliably source, process, and deliver quality hardwood to various buyers. Their decision to operate independently was unusual in an industry increasingly dominated by northern companies with substantial capital. Yet they had managed to carve out a profitable niche, known for delivering precisely what they promised when they promised it, a reputation that earned them contracts with several significant buyers, including suppliers to the Frisco Railway itself. County records indicated that the brothers had purchased the 50-acre parcel with cash, an unusual transaction at a time when most land acquisitions involved credit arrangements. More unusual still was the absence of any documented origin for the Blackwoods prior to their arrival in Fayetteville. When questioned after their disappearance, neighbors and business associates could provide only vague information about the brothers' background. They spoke with what some described as a northern accent, though none could specify exactly where they might have originated. The brothers themselves had been reticent about their past, offering only that they had moved around a good deal before settling in the Ozarks. The Blackwoods property was notable for its location, far enough from town to ensure privacy, but close enough to maintain convenient business connections. It sat on a gently sloping hillside surrounded by oak and hickory forest, with a small creek running along its western boundary. The land had been partially cleared to accommodate the 5 cabins and a central communal area, but the brothers had carefully preserved most of the mature trees, using them as a natural windbreak and maintaining the wooded character that made the site feel removed from the growing bustle of Fayetteville. Those who had visited the property noted the precision with which the cabins had been constructed and arranged. Each structure faced inward toward a central clearing where a large stone fire pit stood. The brothers took their evening meals together in this shared space during warmer months, a practice that struck some as reminiscent of military encampments rather than typical family settlements. The cabins themselves were identical in size and layout, distinguished only by small personal touches that reflected each brother's individual habits and preferences. Thomas, as the eldest, occupied the northernmost cabin, with the others arranged clockwise in order of age. The initial investigation, conducted by Sheriff James McConnell, revealed nothing to suggest foul play. The brothers' personal possessions remained in their cabins. A substantial sum of money, over $400, was found locked in Thomas's iron strongbox, ruling out robbery as a motive. Their horses and wagon were discovered in the stable, well fed and watered. It was as if the 5 men had simply stepped away from their lives, expecting to return at any moment. The calendar in Samuel's cabin was marked with notations about a timber delivery scheduled for December 18th, suggesting no premeditation in their departure. The brothers were known to be reliable businessmen who would never abandon a contract obligation without cause. Sheriff McConnell's initial assessment of the scene noted several peculiarities that defied easy explanation. In each cabin, lamps had been left burning until they exhausted their fuel. Plates of food sat on tables, some with utensils still positioned as if the diners had been interrupted mid-meal. In William's cabin, an open book lay face down beside a chair, a half-empty cup of coffee nearby. Joseph's cabin contained a letter in progress, the pen laid across the page as if he intended to return momentarily to finish his correspondence. The addressee's name had not yet been written. Most puzzling was the condition of the brothers' outerwear. Despite the bitter December cold, their heavy coats remained hanging on pegs near the doors of each cabin. Their gloves, scarves, and hats were similarly in place. If they had left voluntarily, they had done so without the protection that any reasonable person would consider essential in such weather. The only outdoor garments missing were 5 identical oilskin ponchos that the brothers were known to keep in their stables for unexpected rain. No footprints were found leading away from the cabins, though a light snowfall on the night of December 16th might have obscured such evidence. Sheriff McConnell's investigation expanded to include interviews with everyone known to have had contact with the brothers in the weeks preceding their disappearance. The last confirmed sighting came from Marcus Hendricks, proprietor of a general store in Fayetteville, who reported selling supplies to Thomas and William Blackwood on the afternoon of December 15th. Hendricks recalled nothing unusual about their manner or conversation, noting only that they had purchased more coffee and preserved foods than typical, explaining that they were stocking up for the winter weather. As word of the disappearance spread through Fayetteville, various explanations emerged. Some suggested that the brothers had encountered trouble with competitors in the timber industry. The early 1900s were a time of considerable expansion for lumber operations throughout Arkansas, with large northern companies establishing increasingly dominant positions. Independent contractors like the Blackwoods operated at the margins, and conflicts over territories and contracts were not uncommon. Yet investigations into the brothers' business dealings revealed no significant disputes or threats. Their accounts with the First National Bank of Fayetteville were in good order, and their reputation among other timber workers was one of scrupulous fairness. Others whispered about personal vendettas or hidden criminal pasts, theories fueled by the brothers' mysterious origins and private nature. Sheriff McConnell dispatched telegrams to law enforcement agencies across several states, inquiring about any wanted men matching the Blackwoods' descriptions. No responses indicated that the brothers were fugitives from justice elsewhere. The most persistent rumor involved a purported dispute with the powerful Frisco Railway over a large timber contract, but company records showed only routine business transactions with the brothers, all apparently concluded satisfactorily. A more unusual theory emerged from Martin Crowley, a local farmer whose property adjoined the Blackwoods' land. Crowley claimed to have witnessed strange lights moving through the woods near the brothers' cabins on several nights in early December. He described them as like lanterns, but with a bluish glow, unlike regular oil lamps. Crowley had mentioned these sightings to his wife, but had not thought to report them until after the disappearance became known. Sheriff McConnell noted Crowley's statement, but gave it little credence, attributing the sightings to moonlight reflecting off ice-covered branches, or possibly to the farmer's known fondness for homemade apple brandy. As weeks passed with no sign of the Blackwoods, attention turned to their cabins. The structures themselves were unusual, more carefully constructed than typical frontier dwellings, with tight-fitting joinery and thoughtful details that suggested skilled craftsmanship. Each cabin followed an identical floor plan, a main room with a stone fireplace, a small sleeping chamber, and a covered porch facing inward toward the central clearing where the brothers took their communal meals in fair weather. The arrangement created a compound that was both functional and defensible, with clear sight lines to approaching visitors from any direction. One detail that investigators found particularly strange was the uniformity of the brothers' possessions. Each cabin contained nearly identical furniture, dishware, and personal effects, differentiated only by small personal touches. A volume of poetry in Joseph's cabin, a collection of pressed leaves in William's, a set of precisely crafted wood carvings in Elias's. This standardization extended even to their clothing. Examining their wardrobes, Sheriff McConnell noted that each brother owned the same number and type of garments, all of similar quality and apparent age. Despite their reputation for privacy, the Blackwoods had not been complete recluses. They attended services at the First Presbyterian Church in Fayetteville, though they rarely participated in social functions afterward. Thomas and Joseph occasionally joined discussions at a literary society that met monthly at the home of Professor James Caldwell of Arkansas Industrial University, now the University of Arkansas. William had developed a modest friendship with Dr. Raltsey. Edward Harrison, the town physician, bonding over a shared interest in botanical specimens. Samuel was known to frequent Thornton's bookshop on the square, purchasing scientific journals and historical texts. Elias, the youngest, occasionally played fiddle at community gatherings, though he seldom spoke with anyone beyond exchanging pleasantries. These connections, however limited, provided Sheriff McConnell with additional avenues of inquiry. Dr. Harrison recalled that during their last conversation in early December, William had seemed uncharacteristically distracted, repeatedly glancing over his shoulder as they spoke on the street outside the pharmacy. When asked if something was troubling him, William had quickly changed the subject, inquiring about treatments for insomnia. Professor Caldwell reported that Thomas had missed the December meeting of the Literary Society without sending apologies, something out of character for a man known for his punctilious manners. By February of 1904, interest in the case began to wane among the general public, though Sheriff McConnell continued to investigate when his other duties allowed. It was during one such follow-up visit to the property that he made a discovery that would reignite speculation about the brothers' fate. Behind Thomas's cabin, partially concealed by a stand of young oak trees, McConnell found a small structure he had previously overlooked. Unlike the carefully constructed cabins, this building was rough and utilitarian, a simple shed with a padlocked door. Breaking the lock, McConnell found a space that appeared to serve as a communal office for the brothers' timber business. A large desk dominated the room, its surface covered with maps, contracts, and business correspondence. What caught McConnell's attention, however, was a leather-bound ledger unlike the brothers' business accounts. This volume, written in a cramped, precise hand later identified as Thomas's, contained what appeared to be a personal journal dating back to 1896, 2 years before the brothers' arrival in Fayetteville. The entries were sporadic and often cryptic, with frequent references to the arrangement and our obligation. More concerning to McConnell were mentions of watchers and signs of recognition, suggesting a paranoia or secretiveness at odds with the brothers' public reputation for straightforward dealing. Several passages made explicit reference to the brothers' decision to relocate to Fayetteville, describing the area as sufficiently removed and unlikely to attract attention. One entry from April 1898 read, "Established our separate dwellings as agreed." The arrangement continues to serve its purpose, though S. expresses reservations about its necessity after so much time has passed. T. reminds us all that vigilance cannot be relaxed, regardless of appearances. The consequences remain unthinkable. The most troubling entry, dated December 12, 1903, just 5 days before the brothers' disappearance, consisted of a single line. W. believes he was recognized today in town by a man from P. must confirm before taking action. The journal contained no subsequent entries. Sheriff McConnell's investigation could not identify any individual from a place beginning with P. who might have recognized William Blackwood, nor could he determine what action might have been contemplated. Among the papers in the shed, McConnell also discovered a map of the eastern United States, with several locations circled in red ink. These included Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Portland, Maine, Providence, Rhode Island, and Paducah, Kentucky. No annotations explained the significance of these markings. Also present was a newspaper clipping from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch dated November 27, 1903, reporting on the release of a prisoner named Maxwell Thornton from the Western State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. The article had been folded to highlight this item, though it contained no obvious connection to the Blackwoods. Further investigation of the shed yielded additional puzzling items: a small collection of books on criminology and legal procedure, a pamphlet outlining the federal witness protection practices established after several high-profile cases in the 1890s, and 5 identical Colt revolvers, all thoroughly cleaned and loaded. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard, McConnell discovered a wooden box containing 5 sets of identification papers with different surnames, all bearing photographs that appeared to be the Blackwood brothers at younger ages. These documents included work certificates, bank statements, and letters of reference, establishing complete alternative identities. The discovery of the journal and alternative identities transformed public perception of the case. What had seemed a straightforward, if mysterious, disappearance now took on darker implications. Were the Blackwoods fugitives, after all, members of some secretive organization, victims of whoever had recognized William? The journal offered tantalizing suggestions, but no definitive answers. Sheriff McConnell expanded his investigation, sending additional inquiries to law enforcement agencies with specific reference to any incidents in locations beginning with P that might connect to the brothers. In March of 1904, McConnell received a response from the police department in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, indicating that 5 men matching the general description of the Blackwoods had been witnesses in a prominent murder trial there in 1895. According to the Pittsburgh authorities, the men, who had used different surnames, had testified against a powerful businessman accused of arranging the death of a labor organizer during the industrial unrest that had swept the region in the early 1890s. Their testimony had been crucial to securing a conviction, but the businessman had maintained powerful connections even from prison. The Pittsburgh police suggested that the witnesses had been placed in a rudimentary form of protection, relocating to Arkansas under new identities. The businessman in question was identified as Maxwell Thornton, a steel industry magnate with reputed connections to criminal organizations that provided strikebreakers and intimidation tactics during labor disputes. Thornton had been convicted of orchestrating the murder of Frederick Delaney, a charismatic union leader whose organizing efforts had threatened Thornton's factories. The case had attracted significant attention across the industrial Northeast, particularly due to the rare successful prosecution of a wealthy industrialist for crimes against labor organizers. According to the Pittsburgh records, the 5 witnesses, whose descriptions matched the Blackwoods, had been employees at different levels within Thornton's operation who had independently come forward with evidence of his involvement in planning Delaney's death. Their testimony had corroborated one another's accounts despite their different positions within the company, creating a compelling case that had overcome Thornton's expensive legal defense. Following the trial and Thornton's imprisonment, threats against the witnesses had prompted federal authorities to arrange their relocation and new identities, an unusual but not unprecedented measure in cases involving powerful defendants with extensive criminal connections. This information aligned with many details of the brothers' behavior: their reticence about their past, the cash purchase of their property, their tendency to avoid being photographed or attracting attention. But it failed to explain their sudden disappearance. If they had been living under assumed names to avoid retribution, why abandon their established sanctuary without warning? And why leave behind their money and possessions? A partial answer emerged in April of 1904, when a St. Louis newspaper reported the release of Maxwell Thornton, the businessman convicted in the Pittsburgh case, after his sentence was unexpectedly commuted by the governor of Pennsylvania. The article noted that Thornton, upon his release, had made public statements vowing to clear his name of what he termed perjured testimony, and to ensure that justice would find those responsible. The timing of Thornton's release, early December 1903, corresponded with the final entry in Thomas Blackwood's journal and the subsequent disappearance of the brothers. Further investigation revealed that Thornton had traveled to St. Louis immediately after his release, establishing himself at the prestigious Planters Hotel. Hotel records confirmed his residence there from December 8th to December 20th, 1903, a time frame that encompassed the Blackwoods' disappearance. More significantly, a hotel employee recalled Thornton receiving a visitor on December 13th who had arrived from Fayetteville. The visitor was described as a well-dressed man in his 40s who spoke with Thornton privately for over an hour. No name was recorded, but the timing suggested a possible connection to the man from Peter mentioned in Thomas Blackwood's final journal entry. Sheriff McConnell theorized that the Blackwoods, upon learning of Thornton's release and possible presence in the area, had fled their cabins, perhaps assisted by whatever authorities had arranged their original relocation. This explanation was logical, but remained speculative. No confirmed sightings of the brothers were ever reported after December 17, 1903, nor was there evidence that Thornton or his associates had ever visited Fayetteville. The investigation took another turn when a railway porter came forward in May 1904. Claiming to have assisted 5 men, matching the Blackwoods' descriptions, boarding a westbound train at the small station in Johnson, Arkansas, a few miles north of Fayetteville, in the pre-dawn hours of December 17th. The porter recalled the men because they had paid him handsomely to secure a private car and had asked him to ensure that no mention of their passage appeared in the station's records. He described the men as tense and watchful, traveling with minimal luggage and avoiding conversation with other passengers. If this account was accurate, it suggested that the brothers had fled deliberately, making arrangements to conceal their departure. Yet it didn't explain why they had left most of their possessions behind, nor why they had abandoned meals in progress. The porter's description of their minimal luggage contradicted the absence of travel bags or valises from the cabins. Some speculated that the brothers might have maintained emergency supplies elsewhere, anticipating a need for sudden departure. Sheriff McConnell attempted to trace the westbound train's route and check for any disembarkations matching the brothers' descriptions. The line continued to Fort Smith before connecting with routes leading toward Oklahoma Territory, Texas, and points further west. In those still developing regions, men could easily disappear into new identities, particularly those with experience in doing so. McConnell's inquiries produced no definitive sightings, though a hotel proprietor in Fort Smith thought he remembered 5 similar men staying briefly before continuing westward. As months stretched into years, the cabins stood empty. The property, having no clear air, eventually reverted to county ownership for non-payment of taxes. By 1908, 3 of the cabins had been dismantled by locals, salvaging the well-crafted lumber. The remaining 2 stood abandoned, gradually reclaimed by the encroaching forest. Local children began to avoid the area, claiming that, on still nights, one could hear whispered conversations inside the vacant structures, though no one was visible through the windows. Others reported seeing 5 figures moving among the trees at dusk, always maintaining their distance from observers. The Blackwood case might have been forgotten entirely, if not for a curious incident in 1912. A timber scout for the newly formed Phipps Lumber Company was surveying potential acquisition properties in eastern Washington County when he came across an unusual clearing deep in a remote section of the Ozark Forest, approximately 15 miles east of the former Blackwood property. In the clearing stood 5 small, identical cabins arranged in a semicircle, structures that bore a striking resemblance to descriptions of the Blackwoods' original dwellings. The cabins appeared to have been built recently, but no occupants were present, nor were there signs of current habitation. Like the original Blackwood cabins, these structures were well-crafted and eerily similar to one another. The timber scout, James Ledbetter, reported his discovery to his superiors, who initially dismissed it as a coincidence. When Ledbetter mentioned it to an acquaintance who had followed the Blackwood case years earlier, the story reached Sheriff McConnell, who had since retired. McConnell organized an expedition to investigate the site. But when they reached the location described by Ledbetter, they found only a natural clearing. No structures were present, no foundation stones remained, and no evidence suggested that cabins had ever stood there. Ledbetter, accompanying the group, appeared genuinely bewildered, insisting that he had seen the cabins just 3 weeks earlier. This incident added a layer of folkloric mystery to the Blackwood case. Some suggested that Ledbetter had fabricated the story for attention, while others proposed more supernatural explanations, that the cabins appeared only under certain conditions or to certain observers. More pragmatic commentators theorized that if the cabins had existed, they had been deliberately dismantled upon discovery, perhaps by the Blackwoods themselves or individuals connected to them who remained in the area undetected. In 1923, a survey crew mapping the expanded eastern limits of Fayetteville rediscovered the overgrown clearing with the 2 remaining original Blackwood cabins. By this time, the disappearance had faded from public memory, becoming little more than a local legend occasionally recounted at social gatherings. The survey crew's report noted only that the structures were derelict and unsuitable for habitation, recommending their demolition as potential hazards. Before this could occur, however, a fire of unknown origin consumed both cabins on the night of October 12, 1923. The blaze, visible from several miles away, drew a crowd of onlookers, but no firefighting response, as the location was beyond the reach of the town's services. By morning, only stone chimneys remained standing among the ashes. An investigation determined that the fire had started simultaneously in both structures, suggesting deliberate action rather than accident. But no suspects were ever identified. A curious footnote to this incident emerged decades later, when archives of the Arkansas Gazette revealed that on October 12, 1923, the very day of the fire, obituaries had appeared in newspapers in 5 different cities across the western United States: San Francisco, California, Portland, Oregon, Denver, Colorado, Salt Lake City, Utah, and Santa Fe, New Mexico. Each obituary commemorated the passing of an elderly man with a different surname, yet each deceased was described as having arrived in the respective city in early 1904, established a modest timber or lumber-related business, and lived quietly until his death. The ages at death, if accurate, would have matched the Blackwood brothers had they survived until 1923. No connection was made at the time, and the coincidence was only noted by a graduate student researching historical newspaper patterns in the 1970s. In the decades that followed, the Blackwood property was gradually subdivided and developed, as Fayetteville expanded eastward. By the 1950s, a residential neighborhood occupied the area, with no physical reminder of the five brothers or their mysterious fate. Their story might have been entirely forgotten if not for the chance discovery in 1962 of Sheriff McConnell's case files during a reorganization of county records. The detailed documentation, including transcriptions of Thomas Blackwood's journal entries, attracted the attention of a local historian, Dr. Margaret Holloway, who published a monograph on the case that same year. Holloway's research uncovered additional contextual information, including records from the Pittsburgh trial that seemed to confirm the brothers' involvement as protected witnesses. She also located banking records indicating that regular deposits had been made to Thomas Blackwood's account between 1898 and 1903 from a federal marshal's office in St. Louis, suggesting some form of official support for the brothers' new identities. Most significantly, Holloway discovered a brief report in a St. Louis newspaper dated January 3, 1904, noting that Maxwell Thornton had been found dead in his hotel room, apparently from natural causes, on December 28, 1903, 11 days after the Blackwoods' disappearance. The circumstances surrounding Thornton's death raised questions. At 62, he had been in apparently good health upon his release from prison. The newspaper account mentioned that he had been found by hotel staff after failing to respond to a scheduled wake-up call. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, a common designation in that era for any sudden, unexplained death. No autopsy was performed, and Thornton was buried quickly at his family's request. Given his wealth and prominence, the minimal investigation into his passing struck Holloway as unusual, particularly considering the timing relative to the Blackwoods' disappearance. Holloway's monograph presented several possibilities regarding the brothers' fate. The most straightforward theory suggested that the Blackwoods, upon learning of Thornton's release and his stated intention to seek justice against those whose testimony had convicted him, had fled westward to establish new identities once again. This explained their apparent departure by train, but left open the question of why they had abandoned their possessions so abruptly. A darker alternative proposed that Thornton's agents had located the brothers in Fayetteville, perhaps through the man from Peace mentioned in Thomas's journal. Under this scenario, the brothers had been forcibly removed from their cabins and eliminated in retribution for their testimony. The lack of signs of struggle and the absence of any recovered remains made this theory problematic, though not impossible if the perpetrators had been particularly methodical. A third possibility, which Holloway considered most plausible, suggested that federal authorities, having learned of Thornton's release and subsequent inquiries, had hastily extracted the brothers from their established identities to protect them. The abandoned meals and personal effects might have resulted from an urgent middle-of-the-night evacuation that allowed no time for packing or preparations. If this were the case, the 5 obituaries published in 1923 might indeed represent the brothers' final transition out of their second set of assumed identities, coinciding with the symbolic destruction of their original refuge through fire. In 1967, Holloway received an anonymous letter postmarked from Seattle, Washington. The writer claimed to be the grandson of Elias Blackwood, the youngest of the 5 brothers. According to this account, the brothers had indeed fled Fayetteville after learning of Thornton's release, traveling west through Oklahoma Territory before separating to establish new identities in different states. The letter stated that Elias had settled in Oregon under yet another name, eventually marrying and having a family who knew nothing of his past until shortly before his death in 1951. The writer offered a narrative that aligned with Holloway's third theory, but added significant details. According to this account, a federal marshal who had originally arranged the brothers' relocation to Fayetteville had warned them of Thornton's release and subsequent threats. The brothers had maintained an emergency protocol for just such a contingency, including the establishment of separate escape routes and predetermined meeting points. Their abrupt departure from the cabins had occurred when they received word that Thornton had hired investigators who were closing in on their location. Most intriguingly, the letter suggested that the brothers had not been mere passive witnesses, but had actively participated in gathering evidence against Thornton before the murder trial, potentially as agents of a federal investigation into industrial crimes. This would explain the level of protection they received and the apparent official support for their relocation. It also suggested a more complex relationship with authorities than simple witness protection. The letter concluded with a statement that Elias, on his deathbed, had authorized his son to share the truth with his own son, the letter writer, but had extracted a promise that the family would maintain silence for at least 15 years after his passing. This timing coincided with the publication of Holloway's monograph, which the writer claimed had prompted him to reach out despite ongoing concerns about potential repercussions from associates of the long-deceased Thornton. The writer offered no documentation to support these claims, and Holloway's attempts to track the sender through the Seattle postal system proved unsuccessful. Without corroboration, she regarded the letter as an interesting but unverifiable footnote to her research. It remained among her papers when she donated them to the Washington County Historical Society archives in 1968, where it continues to intrigue the occasional researcher who stumbles upon the Blackwood case. Holloway's work inspired renewed interest in the case among local historians and amateur sleuths. One such investigator, Robert Chandler, focused on the 5 obituaries from 1923, attempting to trace the lives of the deceased men backward from their reported deaths. His research, published in a regional historical journal in 1975, revealed that none of the 5 men had established documented existences prior to early 1904, when they appeared in their respective cities with modest capital to establish small businesses. All had maintained low profiles, avoiding political involvement or public prominence. None had left children, though 3 had reportedly married late in life. Most significantly, Chandler discovered that all 5 men had maintained subscription accounts with a St. Louis newspaper service that would have kept them informed of events in that region, including news from Arkansas. This suggested an ongoing interest in the area they had left behind, consistent with the theory that they were the Blackwood brothers living under new identities. However, Chandler found no definitive proof of this connection, merely a pattern of circumstantial evidence supporting its possibility. The most recent development in this long, cold mystery occurred in 1969, when construction workers excavating for a new subdivision on what had once been the eastern edge of the Blackwood property uncovered a collection of personal effects buried approximately 3 feet below the surface. The items, a pocket watch, 5 identical silver rings, and a small metal box containing the torn fragments of what appeared to be identification papers, were turned over to local authorities, who eventually transferred them to the County Historical Museum. Metallurgical analysis dated the artifacts to the early 1900s, consistent with the Blackwood era, but no definitive connection could be established. The deliberate burial of these items, however, suggested intentional concealment rather than casual loss. Perhaps most intriguing was the inscription inside each of the 5 rings. Remember the arrangement. This phrase, echoing the terminology in Thomas Blackwood's journal, strengthened the likelihood that these objects had indeed belonged to the brothers. The pocket watch bore an engraving identifying it as a presentation piece from the Pennsylvania Railroad to T.M. for 20 years of service, dated 1891. This aligned with speculation that the brothers' original identities had been connected to the railroad industry in Pennsylvania before they testified against Thornton. The torn papers, though largely illegible, contained fragments of names that could have been those reported in the Pittsburgh police records as the brothers' original identities. These discoveries lent credibility to the witness protection narrative while raising new questions about why such potentially identifying items would have been buried rather than taken or destroyed. Some researchers have speculated that the buried items represented a form of insurance or contingency plan, physical evidence that could verify the brothers' original identities if ever needed to claim pensions, inheritance, or other benefits tied to their previous lives. Others suggest that the items might have been intended as a message to anyone who might later investigate their disappearance, breadcrumbs deliberately left to suggest one narrative while the truth lay elsewhere. The intentional destruction of the identification papers, leaving just enough to hint at their nature but not enough to confirm specific details, seems particularly calculated. The riddle of the 5 brothers who vanished from their cabins on a cold December day in 1903 remains unsolved. Did they flee successfully, establishing new lives elsewhere, as the Seattle letter suggested? Did they fall victim to Thornton or his agents, their remains never discovered? Or is there another explanation entirely, one that has eluded investigators and historians for over 6 decades? The eastern outskirts of Fayetteville bear no physical markers of the Blackwoods' presence. The land where their cabins once stood is now occupied by modern homes whose residents are largely unaware of the property's unusual history. Yet something of the mystery lingers. Residents occasionally report unusual cold spots in their yards, or the sound of multiple male voices engaged in urgent conversation, audible only at a distance and never intelligible. Others describe a recurring dream of 5 identical cabins arranged in a semicircle, each with a door standing slightly open, inviting entry, yet somehow communicating a warning to stay away. One particularly persistent account comes from a family that built a home directly on the site where Thomas Blackwood's cabin once stood. Shortly after moving in during the spring of 1986, they began experiencing unexplained phenomena. Doors that would open and close of their own accord, the smell of pipe tobacco when no one in the household smoked, the sound of heavy boots on the wooden floors late at night. Most distinctively, they reported finding their kitchen table rearranged each morning with 5 place settings meticulously laid out, despite being put away the night before. The family consulted various experts, from structural engineers who found no issues with the house's construction to paranormal investigators who documented unusual temperature fluctuations and electromagnetic readings, but reached no conclusions about their cause. After 6 months of escalating incidents, including the repeated appearance of the phrase, "Remember the arrangement," written in condensation on bathroom mirrors, the family sold the house at a significant loss and relocated to another state. Subsequent owners have reported no unusual occurrences, leading some to suggest that the phenomena, if genuine, were tied to that specific family for unknown reasons. Local folklore has embraced the Blackwood mystery, incorporating it into the rich tapestry of Ozark legends and ghost stories. Campfire tales speak of 5 silent figures who can be glimpsed walking in formation through remote wooded areas on moonless nights. Hikers occasionally report finding small clearings containing the foundations of 5 structures arranged in a semicircle, locations that cannot be relocated on return visits. During particularly harsh winters, some claim to have seen smoke rising from chimneys that no longer exist, marking the remembered locations of the brothers' cabins. These stories have the embellished quality typical of folklore, elaborating on the documented facts with elements of the supernatural and inexplicable. Yet they serve a purpose beyond mere entertainment, keeping alive the memory of a genuine historical mystery that might otherwise have been forgotten entirely. The Blackwood disappearance represents a moment when the orderly progression of recorded history falters, leaving a narrative gap that invites speculation and wonder. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph for the Blackwood brothers comes from the closing paragraph of Margaret Holloway's monograph. The disappearance of the 5 brothers represents more than a mere historical curiosity. It stands as testament to the fragility of identity and security, even in a place as seemingly removed from the world's dangers as the Ozark Hills of 1903. The brothers came to Fayetteville seeking refuge, constructing lives as carefully engineered as their matching cabins. For 5 years, their arrangement held. Then, in a single day, they vanished as completely as if they had never existed at all. Only the empty structures remained, silent witnesses to whatever urgent departure or terrible fate befell their inhabitants. In this silence lies the true horror of the Blackwood case. Not what we know, but what remains forever beyond our understanding. Today, the land where the Blackwood cabins once stood has been completely transformed. A quiet suburban street cuts through the property, with no physical reminder of the 5 brothers or the mystery that surrounds them. But on certain winter evenings, when the wind blows from the east and darkness settles early over the Ozark Hills, residents sometimes report a strange phenomenon. 5 distinct shadows appear briefly on the walls of their homes, tall, straight-backed silhouettes of men standing in a semicircle, heads inclined toward one another as if in urgent conversation. The shadows never move, never speak, and vanish the moment anyone attempts to approach them. Just shadows from a story that has no ending, echoes from a mystery that was never solved. In 2015, an elderly woman named Eleanor Simmons contacted the Washington County Historical Society with an account that added yet another layer to the Blackwood mystery. Simmons, then 93 years old, claimed to be the daughter of a man who had worked as a telegrapher at the Fayetteville station of the Frisco Railway in 1903. According to Simmons, her father had confided to her shortly before his death in 1965 that he had been involved in the Blackwood case in a peripheral but significant way. As Simmons told it, her father had received a confidential telegram on December 16, 1903, instructing him to arrange for a private rail car to be attached to the westbound train passing through Johnson in the early hours of December 17th. The telegram came from a federal marshal's office in St. Louis and specified that 5 men would board without standard ticketing procedures and that no record was to be kept of their passage. The telegrapher was sworn to secrecy and well compensated for his discretion. What made his account particularly interesting was his claim that he had personally observed the 5 men boarding the train. They arrived at the station in a covered wagon driven by a man he recognized as a deputy U.S. Marshal who occasionally passed through Fayetteville on official business. The brothers appeared tense but not under duress, moving quickly and speaking little. Most notably, the telegrapher reported that one of the brothers, the youngest, based on descriptions of Elias, paused before boarding the train, turned to look back toward Fayetteville, and said clearly to the marshal, "He'll come looking." He always does. Simmons provided no documentation to support her father's account, and she passed away several months after sharing her story, before historians could conduct follow-up interviews to assess its credibility. Like many elements of the Blackwood case, this late testimony tantalizingly suggests a narrative while stopping short of providing conclusive evidence. If accurate, it would confirm that the brothers departed voluntarily under federal protection rather than falling victim to foul play, but it doesn't explain the bizarre condition of the cabins they left behind. The enduring fascination with the Blackwood mystery stems partly from its resistance to neat resolution. Unlike many historical puzzles eventually solved through the discovery of new documents or forensic analysis of physical evidence, the case of the 5 brothers remains fundamentally ambiguous. The documented facts, their arrival in Fayetteville, their successful establishment as timber contractors, their abrupt disappearance leaving meals half-eaten and possessions behind, frame a story whose middle and end remain unwritten. In this ambiguity lies the true psychological horror of the Blackwood case. It reminds us that even in our modern era of comprehensive documentation and digital footprints, individuals can still vanish from the narrative of history, leaving behind only questions and conjectures. The brothers' story touches on primal fears of forced displacement, threatened identity, and the fragility of the lives we construct. Their careful arrangement of 5 identical cabins, 5 identical lives, maintained through vigilance and secrecy, speaks to the human desire for control in an unpredictable world, control that was ultimately illusory. For the residents of Fayetteville, the legacy of the Blackwood mystery manifests in subtle ways. Local historians include it among the town's notable historical enigmas. Amateur ghost hunters occasionally conduct overnight investigations in the vicinity of the former property. Children dare one another to spend time alone in the small park that now occupies a portion of the original 50 acres, particularly on December 17th, the anniversary of the disappearance. The brothers have become part of the cultural memory of the region, their story preserved even as the physical evidence of their existence has vanished entirely. What became of the 5 men who vanished from their cabins on that cold December day in 1903 remains unknown. Perhaps they found new refuge in distant cities under yet another layer of assumed identities. Perhaps they met a violent end at the hands of those seeking retribution for their testimony. Or perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between these possibilities, in the complex negotiations between vulnerability and protection, exposure and concealment, that characterized their documented lives in Fayetteville. In the end, the Blackwood brothers left behind not just abandoned cabins, but a narrative void that we instinctively seek to fill. Their story resonates because it reminds us of the limitations of historical knowledge and the persistent human need to make sense of the seemingly senseless. The empty cabins with their half-eaten meals and carefully arranged possessions stand as a metaphor for all the interrupted stories, the unexplained departures, and the unresolved mysteries that haunt the margins of recorded history. And so, the Blackwood mystery endures, not despite its unanswered questions, but because of them. The 5 brothers who came to Fayetteville seeking anonymity achieved in their disappearance a kind of immortality, their names and faces preserved in the ongoing effort to understand what happened to them. They remained frozen in that moment of December 1903, perpetually on the verge of revelation or concealment, their ultimate fate as elusive now as it was to Sheriff McConnell when he first pushed open the door to Thomas Blackwood's cabin and found it inexplicably empty.